Good evening. Welcome to eFlux. Thank you all for coming out tonight. My name is Stephen Squibb, and it's my distinct pleasure to introduce Marco Baravalle to you tonight. He is a central figure at SAIL Docs. That's capital S, lowercase a, capital L-E, Docs. Sale? Sale. Good. Sale Docs, an independent space for visual arts, activism, and experimental theater, located in what had been an abandoned salt storage facility in Dorsoduro, Venice. Founded in 2007, its programming includes activist group meetings, formal exhibitions, screenings, and actions. In addition to managing the diverse programming at Sale Docs, Baravalle also is a research fellow at, can you say that? How do you say your university in Venice? Oh, Ca' Foscari, yes, Ca' Foscari University in Venice. He researches art and activism, creative labor, gentrification, and how art is positioned within neoliberal economics. And he's going to talk to you tonight about art and populism. And I don't want to spoil anything. It's a great talk. But I was recently in Italy to talk about Gramsci, and Alfredo Jar was there, and he showed this snippet of that Pasolini film, which my colleague Mariana was trying to tell me about just now, where Pasolini stages an interview with a newspaper reporter and a movie director. And I think it's totally hilarious. But one of the things that the reporter asks the movie director, what is this film about? You've made this film as a famous Marxist, so what is it about? And the director looks at him and says, well, it's about my deep and abiding Catholicism, which is, of course, something of a reality with Pasolini, that he's somehow both Marxist and Catholic at the same time. But in the question of art and populism, on the 500th anniversary of the Protestant Reformation, this question of what sorts of representations are available to whom and under what circumstances continues to be an incredibly active one. And so please join me in welcoming Marco.
So thank you. Thank you very much for being here, and thank you to eFlux for inviting me. Can you hear well? Yeah. Do you hear well? Okay, perfect. First of all, I apologize, but I'm going to read because I don't really trust my English when it comes to theoretical matters. So I'm sorry, I know it's a bit boring, but for the sake of precision, I prefer to read. So as Stephen mentioned, my paper is titled Art, Populism, and the Alterinstitutional Turn. And my starting point is the controversy of Scrittorie Popolo. Scrittorie Popolo is a book by the Italian literary critic Alberto Azorrosa, which was published in 1965. It has been recently translated in English by Seagull Books with the title The Writer and the People, using the singular, the writer. And when the book was published back in 1965, Azorrosa belonged to a group of dissident communist intellectuals called the operaists, or the workerists, which are now, I think, quite well known in the art world, let's say. And with this book, with Scrittorie Popolo, the operaista position enters the cultural debate as an outrageous offensive against post-World War II leftist Italian literature that the author labeled as populist. The thesis of Azorrosa is that the hegemony of the Italian Communist Party influenced the agenda of many writers, imposing the people as the main subject of narration and as the main successor of the anti-fascist war of liberation. But Azorrosa judged the people to be a regressive cultural subject that reflected the abandoning of a true revolutionary program by the official party. And instead, he referred to the class as the only possible social construct capable of a radical transformation of reality. So you can see it as a sort of the people versus the class. And Azo Rosa criticizes a trivialized use of the Gramscian notion of national popular, which in Italian is called the nazional popolare, a notion that deeply influenced cultural production. And Gramsci is famous for his idea of revolution as a people thing, which again in Italian sounds like un fatto di popolo, a people's thing that through patriotism needed to mobilize different sectors of society far beyond the proletariat. Of course, we do have to contextualize this position, because back in the 60s, this cultural confrontation was within the field of the Italian left, and it was between the official apparatus of the party, its hegemony on culture and arts on one side, and a group of dissident communist intellectuals on the other. And these dissidents were looking at the Fordist factory working class as the true subject of revolution. And a revolution, Opera claimed, only possible on the most advanced sector of capitalist production, which was the Fordist factory back at the time, and largely to be cultivated through means of self-organization, so beyond the party and beyond the traditional unions. Even if, to be precise, this was not the thinking of the whole group of the operaisti. A part of the operaisti also thought that the struggle would be to be carried within and inside the official structure of the party, but this is another story. So, and I started from this book because of two reasons. First of all, if, like Ernesto Laclau taught us, populism is an empty signifier, then Azo Rosa suggests a grid of interpretation of this signifier when associated with a cultural product, a novel in this specific case. So, first of all, because when we say populist, we can mean whatever we want, and Azo Rosa instead suggests a few features to be associated to a cultural product when we talk about populist art, literature in this peculiar case. Second reason, because it addresses leftist populism, and I think that the debate on how to answer to the wave of reactionary populism that invested half of the world, including the US, is a relevant debate even for the art and the cultural field. And of course, we must be clear, Azo Rosa works only as a point of departure, but one has to immediately update his discourse to a world that has completely changed from 1965 and to a different disciplinary field, the visual arts, which is of course different from literature. Still, I thought it was worth trying. So, when can we speak of populist art according to Azo Rosa? We can speak of populist literature, and I quote, whenever the literary discourse contains a positive evaluation of the people in ideological, historical, social, or ethical terms. Populism implies that the people is presented as a model, end quote. And independently from the political stance of the author, in Italy, this peculiar literary genre presented some recurring features. And again, I'm going back to the features presented by or isolated by Azo Rosa, two of them. First of all, a certain hostility towards cosmopolitanism, the predilection for the national space, as well as localist and regionalist narratives. Second, the adhesion to traditional formal models and the disapproval of any avant-gardist experimentation. And so I asked myself, where do we find something that could be compared to this definition in the field of, let's call it, engaged or progressive contemporary arts of the last decades? So the first body of works that came to my mind was, I think, a very easy one to isolate. I'm referring to the series of documentaries shot in Venezuela by Dario Azzolini and Oliver Ressler between 2004 and 2010. These documentaries are portraying the effects of the Chavist Bolivarian revolution on the country. And I'm referring precisely to three titles. The first one is Venezuela from Below, 2004. The second one is Fight Factory Workers' Control in Venezuela from 2006. And the third one is Comuna Under Construction, 2010. And these documentaries focus mostly on the subaltern strata of population, and to put it in Ernesto Laclau's terms, on their transformation from plebs to populus. We will come back to this process of transformation from plebs to populus in a minute. And as envisaged by the Bolivarian apparatus, the lower levels of the population stop representing only a part of society, only one part of society, and become a totality, the socialist people of Venezuela. In 3 lines, this is a process of the populist reason as described by Ernesto Laclau, but we will come back to it. I need to be clear on one point, though. My intent here is not to judge these documentaries on a political level, nor to oversimplify Azzolini's and Ressler's work, which deals with crucial issues such as democratic participation, political organization, and workers' self-management. However, I think it's very important to notice how this work shows some aspects that refer to the idea of cultural populism as presented above, as presented by Alberto Azzorrosa in his old book. So there are a few features that I isolated. The first one, why they can be called populist documentaries, let's say. First, they abstain from using the meta-documentary format based on the questioning of the documented narration as objective narration of the facts, as legitimate representation of reality, and as a recovery of a stable and permanent memory. This is a tradition which is very, on the contrary, very alive in those artists or directors that work from a post-socialist point of view, for example. On the contrary, Azzolini and Ressler's documentaries are openly means of diffusion and affirmation of the Bolivarian discourse without any effort to deconstruct it, although it must be said they never succumb to propaganda. So the authors filmed an historical process in its making, so that it's not possible to use the prefix post to describe the documentary's aesthetic features. This is the first reason. The second one is the fact that this tendency affects the formal choices made by the directors, who aim to linear narration and have a clear pedagogical intent. Third point, the documentaries deal with a national revolution, a process limited to the space of the nation-state. Of course, socialism in Latin America wasn't a fact that, let's say, interested only one country, but in this case here, the space of the nation-state is clearly the space in which this let's say, this Bolivarian process takes place. 4, in Azzolini's and Ressler's work, the connection between cultural products and Bolivarian political apparatus is crystal clear. And this connection doesn't pertain exclusively to populist governments, and it can emerge in different forms, either positive or negative, but is for sure a prerogative of any populist program, as the documentaries in question clarify. And at this point, I think we should go deeper into this topic, and we should ask ourselves, but is populist art only limited to artworks that depict populism? And of course, I think the answer is no. And I found, following the debate on art and populism, I found quite strange that, as far as I know, at least no one really spotted the fact that in her very famous article titled Antagonism and Relational Aesthetics, Claire Bishop opposes to relational aesthetics the category of antagonism. A notion that, according again to Laclau and Mouffe, is one of the pillars of what I've called the populist reason. Indeed, Laclau and Mouffe are mentioned by Bishop as 2 essential sources for her critique. So Bishop, in this famous article, targets the presupposed emancipatory power of relational aesthetics. She affirms that more intrinsically democratic art practices exist and are those that present antagonism as their main feature. And she makes 2 examples. I will limit myself to analyzing one. She makes the example of the work of the Spanish very famous artist Santiago Sierra. And according to Claire Bishop, relational aesthetics would illusorily think of society as an immanent togetherness, where conflict is completely excluded as something bad, in favor of what I call an ideology of dialogue, where the speakers can bring every kind of differences to the table, and they can present themselves as fully formed and centered subjectivities. It is at this point that the notion of antagonism, as understood by Mouffe and Laclau, which in turn referred to Gramsci and Lacan, appears. According to the Argentinian and to the Belgian scholars, antagonism is a positive feature that allows a social order to be fluid and democratic instead of rigid and authoritarian. And this happens because the conflict happens between subjectivities understood in Lacanian terms, that is, as decentered entities. Understood in such a way, antagonism does not appear as a clash or a war or a frontal clash, because, exactly according to Lacan, the presence of the other always prevents one subjectivity to fully center itself, resulting in a structurally incomplete and split entity. So, Bishop thinks of the work of Santiago Sierra, which I think we are all more or less familiar. Bishop thinks of the work of Santiago Sierra as being one that actually activates a kind of antagonist relationship with the audience. The radical otherness Sierra represents, by mimicking the bodily and economic violence of capitalist power relationships, should shake and maybe question the subjective certainties of the public of contemporary arts. And I think that the work of Santiago Sierra actually presents what we could call a populist differential. He always choosing working class, marginal, impoverished subjects as performers. For example, unemployed workers, prostitutes, drug addicts, migrants, etc. Characters that I think could recall some sort of Pasolinian universe. And I think, fortunately, a Pasolinian universe closer to the cruel movie Salò than to the edifying novel A Violent Life. And well, it's useful to remember that for Azor Rosa, Pasolini embodied the crisis of populist literature. Still, the people kept the center of the stage. And I think that something similar can be affirmed in reference to Sierra. People here are not depicted as an ideal model. Instead, they are often deprived of their agency by the metaphor produced by the artist. Still, or exactly because of their destiny as victims, the suffering of the people is seen as a sort of redemption through a penance where a Catholic matrix clearly surfaces. Bishop's preference for Sierra's work eventually excludes that art could have any direct social implication besides providing a disturbing mirror for our audience. And my suspect when confronted with Sierra's art is that it is too inclined to become a liturgy for the unavoidable suffering of the people. And I have two more objections to share. So the first one is a theoretical objection, because Bishop isolates the category of antagonism, presenting it as the final or the ultimate effect of the work of art. While we must not forget that for Laclau and Mouffe, antagonism is a transitory phase in a process. This is very important. It's not the ultimate effect of populism, but it's a transitory phase in a process. The process of the construction of the people. And this process schematically works as it follows. We first have the plebs, so the partiality of the poor, that antagonize the establishment, the rich and the empowered partiality. And through this conflict, the plebs become the populus, the people. Populus is a Latin word that could be translated as the people. So one partiality sees itself as the whole of society and becomes a totality. Of course, this totality, as presented by Laclau, is temporary and decentered. Still, it remains a totality. The second objection is a political objection, which is not aimed to Bishop, of course, but to the possible political implication of a populist position. I think that Laclau theory should be managed carefully. Too often, again, in my opinion, those who are in favor of a normative application of Laclau ontology are strong supporters of what is called the autonomy of the political, that is, the separation of the social and the political sphere. And this often translates into a choice of the party as the main way of organization and into a temptation to adopt nationalistic rhetorics, for example. And speaking of autonomy, I think that to contrast the too comfortable open-endedness of relational aesthetics, and despite the reference to the split and uncentered subjectivity, to restate the reassuring notion of a fully centered, recognizable work of art is somehow defeatist. We find here the usual appeal to autonomy of the artwork that draws safe borders between art and society. And even if elsewhere I joined the crowded choir of critical voices against relational aesthetics, saying that it provided both an ideological discourse and a set of tactics useful to shape the institution of art as one of the most effective governmental dispositives of the neoliberal era, I would like to search further and to look beyond antagonism for possible answers to our need for radical art practices. So, at this point, I think a polarity has emerged. A polarity between populism on one side and what is called institutionalism on the other side, where relational aesthetics corresponds to the institutionalist pole and antagonism to the populist pole. So we speak of institutionalism when differentiality is the only legitimate equivalent, when all the differences are admitted in a wider totality. We speak of populism when this symmetry is broken, when a part of society chooses to see itself as the whole, becoming the people, when antagonism comes into play. So let's ask ourselves, is it possible from the point of view of those who are interested in radical art and cultural practices to break this dichotomy, to break this alternative? And here, at this point, the term alterinstitutional could represent a possible suggestion, even if not certainly a final and completely exhaustive answer. And to be completely honest, critical points are many, and it must not be forgotten that they need to be seriously addressed. And I use the term alterinstitutional in order to define what? A set of practices or something even less defined, an attitude traceable in the art field that could present a series of important differences. Differences in relationship to, let's say, antagonism in art as a populist approach, and differences in relationship with, let's say, the ideology of the relational aesthetics. So what kind of differences alterinstitutionalism embody? I listed 4. So the first one is that I'm referring to practices that envisage intersubjectivity as a terrain for a necessary conflict. So we do not deny conflict, and at the same time for the creation of a new social bond. These practices keep together conflict and social bond. Second feature, practices that promote an understanding of the social dimension different from that of an immanent togetherness affirmed by relational aesthetics. Society is no togetherness. Third, practices that take a different stance on the artwork's autonomy in opposition to the idea of a defined artwork that brings to light the undefined nature of subjectivity, but without any possibility of intervention on a social level. And fourth feature is practices that embody an attitude different from populist affirmation that risk to seek to the adulation of power and to narrate reality as it should be, a characteristic that was already predominant in socialist realism, for example. Even progressive populism ran the risk of thinking of art as information, where information must be intended in Deleuzian terms as the diffusion of what it calls in French the mot d'ordre, the word of order, the order. On the contrary, when social movements and art creation assemble, but they don't assemble in a mutually instrumental relationship, like, for example, happened during the movement of 1977 in Italy, then the forms of expression can begin to refuse the word of order. And through the choice of building, and I'm quoting some phrases from Attraverso, which was a militant magazine published in 1977 in Italy by these people belonging to this very radical social movement. And then the forms of expression can begin to refuse the word of order, and through the choice of building, quote, a linguistic collective and subversing functioning that can aim at disrupt what was then defined as the dictatorship of meaning. And these last two quotes are from this militant magazine published in 1977, which was titled Attraverso. So again, linguistic, collective, and subversive functioning aimed at destroying the dictatorship of meaning. We need, and sometimes we encounter, practices that combine different aspects and understand affirmation as investing into the creation of social relationships on the side of the commons, against neoliberal governmental devices and reactionary populism, which, by the way, are only apparently in opposition. And when art chooses this side, it doesn't adhere to any dogma. Rather, it questions emerging dogmatic traits, and it operates according to a materialistic logic in order to realize the common through some feature, through agency diffusion, through free distribution of knowledge, through the experimentation of models of production and economy, as well as through the creation of new algorithms and the reinvention of institutional infrastructure. All of these beyond neoliberal capture and against the populist enrollment. Of course, all of this is not free from criticality, and we will see what limits these alterinstitutional practices are kind of facing now, but let's go step by step. So, back in 2015, the art magazine, After All, devoted the main focus of one issue to a certain tendency that was becoming more and more common among artists. This tendency is the idea of the artist as someone who designs, creates, and implements those who can be called quasi-institutions, para-institutions, and that sometimes surfaced in the European social movement debates as with other definitions, such as institution of the commons or monster institution, to use a definition created by Gerhard Raunig. We will call them alter institutions, just to add more confusion, of course. So the articles I'm referring to by Sven Lüttiken and Ekaterina de Gaulle refer to some artist projects, such as the Silent University by Ahmet Ogut, the New World Summit and the Artists Organization International by Jonas Stahl, and the Immigrant Movement International by Tania Bruguera. One of the articles was indeed titled The Artist as Director. That probably is the Artist as Curator. Lüttiken argues that these practices highlight an evolution in institutional critique, where the center of attention shifts from the critique of the institution to its invention. And these projects, although different, they share some characters. First of all, the urgency of guaranteeing access to welfare services, particularly those linked to education, to those who have been denied. We're referring here to migrants without residency permit, asylum seekers, precarious workers, activist groups, Middle Eastern feminist associations, and so on. The second feature that they share, the conscious and problematical use of new communication technologies and the end of the divide between humanistic and digital approach. And I would like now to present two examples of this alter-institutional term that are in a way similar but also different from each other. And the first one, it is a failed project for this last documenta, which was titled The Cooperativist Society. And the second one is a very different project, which is basically is a social movement project, and it's called Saledox, and it's this collective and the space I'm part of in Venice. So let's begin with the Cooperativist Society. As I told you, this is a largely unrealized project which was part of the public program of the last controversial documenta in Athens. And we don't have time to open a parenthesis on documenta 14. Besides, I did not visit the exhibition, so I can't say something serious about what I don't know. But let me tell you that what I think is sort of paradoxical is that confronting to the risk of bankruptcy, as we witnessed recently with documenta, bankruptcy be true or false, the German politics did not hesitate to offer financial help, while the European institutions, and Germany before all, were as much sure to condemn Greece through a colonialistic austerity program. And on the other side, it surprised me a bit that the staff of Documenta 14 had to wait for the news to break and for the interference of some politicians to raise crucial questions such as the scale of biennials, their geopolitical economy, and the, quote, exploitative working condition of the people working for such events. I think of it a bit as a lost occasion in a way. Anyway, let's go back to the projects. Cooperativist society. One of the members of the collective told me that he looks at this project as a very interesting failure. Originally, this project was formed because Documenta, the institution, called a group of people dealing with alternative currency to make a suggestion about how to critically look, intervene, and reform the financial infrastructure of the exhibition. All of the first proposals were rejected as too radical, and the project, excluded by the main exhibition list, finally found a home within the public program curated by Paul Preciado. Nonetheless, eventually, apart from a presentation lecture held in Athens, the project was cancelled mainly because of shortcuts to the budget. But what was the project about? The working group of cooperative society was composed by hackers, artists, activists, aimed to use the exhibition's brand and visibility to redirect part of the economic income towards solidarity networks and cooperative economies in Greece. I'm referring to of course, to the brand's visibility of Documenta, to redirect part of the economy income towards solidarity networks and cooperative economies in Greece, and at the same time to build a laboratory, an actual space in the Exarchia neighborhood for the design of new artistic models defined by horizontality and sharing. So the idea was that the visitors could buy a prepaid card at the exhibition's gates that could be topped up with cryptocurrencies. Visitors could buy fair coins, a digital currency designed to meet environmental, social, and democratic requirements that supports those activities that are engaged in cooperative and ethical production. And once the visitor had a card, fair coins could be spent within a network of independent producers, ethical shops, and activities born from social self-organization. For the network's partners, of course, there was the possibility to cash out in case they found difficulties in using the fair coin. Surely, a project like this cooperativist society did not invent ethical finance or cooperation, but they try a more radical approach by reinventing their tools. And the shared characteristic is the creation of means of production and institutional models oriented to the commons instead of capitalist accumulation or neoliberal policies. And what can we say about these practices? So, first of all, it seems to me that this project and other similar projects can avoid falling into the trap of the network culture that was so fashionable some years ago, as this project takes into great consideration the capital's capacity to capture the so-called horizontal practices, which are implemented by singularities that are both cooperating and competing at the same time. Secondly, they understand that automation is not the enemy, but at the same time, it has to incorporate a human relationship to be effective beyond capitalistic accumulation and meaning deprivation. And we see here some important features, for example, and some important differences. So we see here how the relationship under consideration unfolds in a space which is defined by power structures, be it the ones at work within the art institution or in society at large. And at the same time, this relationship tries to create a new social bond in a space of irreducible multiplicity. And these aspects detach the above-mentioned project from both relational aesthetic institutionalism and from antagonist populism. And one of the most interesting traits of these practices is the crossing between claimed radical democracy and technological development. In consideration of the time we are living in, the focus of these operators, and I use the term operators because the group, and these groups often include both artists and non-artists, is the focus is on financialization of society. And these groups, they aim to intervene in the growing gap between the power gained through private ownership algorithms, being public or private property, doesn't matter, and algorithms that are activated for profit or control purposes, and the limited common use of open algorithms, which is something very important, but still very, very weak compared to the private use of algorithms by private companies. And now I think, and we are going to the final part of the paper, now I think the question to be asked is, what are the limits of this alter-institutional turn? As this type of practices is still largely encouraged by many art institutions, the fact that it is at the same time mostly developed through traditional roles like the artist, the curator, the audience, and developed through traditional devices like large-scale exhibition, the museum, the biennial, the festival, the art school, etc. This fact means that this type of practices often ends up by obeying to the function that the neoliberal apparatus assigned to the art world, a function of government and economic valorization of critical and subversive thought and imagery. So how to free then this alter-institutional potential? Or to put it in Gregory Cholet's terms, how to autonomously organize the social creative dark matter? How to avoid the destiny of this social creative dark matter that seems to lead to an unsatisfactory alternative, either to be condemned to invisibility, to consume products and services, to be a pillar of the mainstream art world, or the alternative, to be illuminated only to become a part of the system, but with no possibility to interfere with its power and economic relationships. So I think that many possible answers to these questions need to be experimented through assemblages between art people, social movements, grassroots organizations, cooperatives, etc. Even existing art institutions are not disqualified. To mention again Claire Bishop, in her more recent essay, Radical Museology, she shed some light on 3 case studies of museums that are working in the direction of politicizing the way their permanent collection are exhibited, overcoming the alternative between a modernistic Eurocentric approach on one side and a market-driven postmodern stance on the other. So museums like Reina Sofia in Madrid, the Van Abben Museum in Eindhoven, or the MUSM in Ljubljana are very interesting examples under this point of view. But the assemblage we are thinking of is the most effective way to find what? To find new subjective possibilities for artists, art students, curators, and for cultural workers in general, in opposition to the neoliberal framework. This is very, very important. This is a crucial aspect, to work on new subjective possibilities for us, basically. And we are referring to a new subjectivity which is not shaped by the model of the entrepreneur of the self, which is not stuck into a mobility that forces alter institutions to fade out within too short temporal frames. A subjectivity which is not indebted and precarious for life. A subjectivity which is not carved by the idea of creation as a private action in an era where creation presents itself with the features of a structural cooperation. A subjectivity which is not fueled by the adrenaline of the market competition and at the same time is not domesticated by the rare privilege of a vanishing welfare state. In short, I'm deeply convinced that what we need is to associate the word art to different forms of life. And also, seen under this light, the project and the construction of alter institutions cannot be reduced to the last trend in contemporary art event economy, but it becomes a way to structurally empower the existence of different art worlds, today, not tomorrow. A new infrastructure is needed. A new physical, digital, linguistic, and economic infrastructure has to be empowered in order for art to be up to a situation where, despite a still very strong governmental system, economic crisis and the reactionary political phase are working together to bring art closer and closer to financialization, to the event economy, to entertainment, to national identity, to gentrification, to traditions and to traditional techniques and form. And to go immediately to the second project, I would like to briefly sketch, because it's not even a presentation. And these are some worries that 10 years ago now led us, a group of cultural workers, artists, and activists to occupy Sale Docks, a space in Venice hosted by a former ancient and beautiful salt storage really in the heart of the historical city. And we began 10 years ago in 2007, and we wanted to sort of organize an action, exhibition, and research center. And our idea was and still is to experiment a type of art institution that works as a concrete and actual critique of the neoliberal art dispositif, the neoliberal art device. What we do, many things, but for example, we investigate how the business of collateral events of the Biennale works as an engine for gentrification in an already hyper-gentrified environment like the historical city of Venice. We investigate and we organize action against the precarity of cultural workers and the massive use of unpaid labor in town and also on a global scale. I'm referring here to our collaboration with the campaign of Gulf labor that you well know. Sometimes we do host very well-known artists, curators, or museum directors, but we always try to make our space and resources available for local artists and cultural producers. And our collective for example, takes active part to the social movement struggles in the city. For example, 10 days ago, we hosted an assembly called by the Committee Against Big Cruise Ships in Venice with more than 200 environmental activists from all over Europe. For a few years, we developed a peculiar format of exhibition where the production process was completely open to everyone who wanted to join this production process, and it resulted in a long-term practice that pushed the borders of the exhibition format, but at the same time criticizing it. The title of the project was Open, and it involved hundreds of artists, students, and cultural workers. It was really like a long-term laboratory about, and it ended up being a sort of tool that transformed the exhibition from an exhibition into a sort of tool for investigate the city. It was very interesting. I don't have time to go into details now. Last May, for example, we organized a 3-day program called Dark Matter Games, in which we try to mobilize this dark matter of producers, of consumers that every year gathers for the opening of the Biennale, etc. And at the same time, we always try to work not only against, but also from within the continuous pressure of the official art world. An art world which is more and more eager, I think, to colonize the ever-narrowing spaces left out by privatization and gentrification in our Western city. And these spaces and subjects are from time to time called the local, the community, the neighborhood, the migrants, the grassroots activists, the poor, the workers, etc. For example, when we were asked to intervene in the edition of the Creative Times Summit in Venice in 2015, we were asked to deliver a speech about, like local situation. And acknowledging that this Creative Summit was a lot based around the issue of post-colonial, we invented a character and a new position from which to speak, which was the post-local activist, in a way trying to acknowledge the fact that as locals we are both sort of colonized and colonizers at the same time within the neoliberal art system. So we did lots of projects. And I want to finish this paper by saying that, of course, if we broaden our horizon to the entire social dimension, there are, I think, few reasons to be optimistic. We can't delude ourselves, and we need to understand the importance of the artistic practice that, even though in different ways, give this dark social and creative dark matter a new visibility by trying to organize the creation in new autonomous form beyond the neoliberal model and in opposition to populist identity-based culture. So I think that really now what we're trying to do is to try to develop, to discover, and to explore this third way between relational aesthetic and antagonistic populism. I don't know if we succeed, but thank you for your attention. I know it's kind of hard to follow the reading. I know, sorry.
Thank you for that wonderful lecture, Marco. You mentioned the workerist tradition a few times, and I would be curious, you know, one of the centered platforms, for lack of a better term, of the workerist tradition is the refusal of work.
Sure.
And one thing we notice being around the art world is that the art world is invested in a discourse of work, both sort of artworks themselves, we refer to them as works, but also this idea of the importance of work and of labor in testifying to our seriousness and our sincerity as sort of artist activists. So how do you locate these two things side by side, the refusal of work and the sort of embrace of it by the art world?
Well, of course, I mean, I don't want to go too much into theoretical matter because I'm afraid I was already too theoretical. But what we witness as activists occupying a cultural space in Venice, for example, and trying to intervene a lot into the struggles of the cultural workers in Venice, is that basically today the refusal of work, I wouldn't say it doesn't work, but it must be rethought, I think, a lot. I mean, that's also why I think we watch with a certain interest alterinstitutional practices, because until a certain point, they also embody a refusal of work, which is a refusal of work under a neoliberal perspective, and at the same time, they're trying to elaborate autonomous production models. So what we witnessed, not on a theoretical level, but on a practical level, trying to really to be part of the struggle of the workers or trying to organize some small struggles as solid docs, is that the key today, besides all the hype on, I don't know, for example, like, like human strike or the withdrawal, I mean, it's very, very difficult to intervene without thinking another way of working. So I would put it very, very simply like this, The net worker or the present cultural worker, Paolo Virno wrote a very, very like classical essay now in 2001, I think, The Grammar of Multitude, in which he said that nowadays cultural work is not only, let's say, what defines works in general, but it embodies the features that before were the feature of politics. So cultural work and artist work is too much political for the artist or for the cultural worker to just withdraw and to go to some more traditional forms of organization. So I think the challenge now, which is very, very hard challenge, is how to autonomously organize the work, this political work that cultural workers and artists do around the world. And alter institutions can be a possible answer if they also lead to alternative subjective path. What I don't believe is that from the safe position of the curator, from the safe position of the artist, one can really have a transformative power in society, or even a smaller goal, like to really transform the way the system, the power relationship and the economical relationships within the artwork. I think that, again, to assemble, to figure new subjective path is crucial. What do I mean by this? Because otherwise it remains very, very theoretical. Like a few years ago, in Italy there was a wave of occupations of theaters, of cultural space led by cultural workers. And the claim was to avoid the privatizations of many of these spaces. And what was this movement ended kind of very badly, I would say. After 2 or 3 years, it really became weaker and weaker progressively. But what was, I think, very important was that for the first time, I think, from 1977, cultural workers and artists in Italy could see another possible space for the practice, another possible space which was not which was not the art market, not only intended as the art market of objects, but also as the art market of institutions, of festivals, etc. They said, wow, we can be artists in a different way from the neoliberal economy standard, from the neoliberal economy framework. And this was extremely powerful. Then the point was that this was probably a short, a limited framework, temporarily speaking. But it is something, I think it's something that many artists could be compared to how, for example, Occupy Wall Street influenced the way many US or many New York artists looked at their practices here. It's something that you discover not in theory, not at school. For example, I think that, but you discover it, I would say, with a populist expression in the streets. And for example, I think that nowadays progressive art schools are at the same time a great, let's say, occasion of education for many young artists, but at the same time they're deeply problematic, because these people, for example, what happens in Italy is that as much as they study Deleuze, Foucault, Antonio Negri, Agamben, the more they study this author, the less they want to intervene in society, in social movements. It is really, really a very effective governmental tool today. And so we are, again, the challenge is to find ways against, within, or in alternative to this governmental logic, which in a way accepts your radical thinking, radical thoughts, as long as it does not modify any power structure. And what we will probably face, and what we are already facing more and more now with this reactionary phase. So the coming back, the return of a very reactionary position in the arts, censorships, and so on and so forth.
Yeah, thank you.
There are here, by the way, 2 artists, Terika Poya, which also I think she's very active and has a very interesting practice. I don't know if you would define yourself alterinstitutional, I don't know, but in a way you're working within this field.
Yeah, thank you for the ad hoc introduction. Yeah, really enjoyed your talk, and feel that there's a lot of resonance. I've also been working on mimicking institutional structures as artists, as many other people here. And I was thinking, I feel that there is this when you create these temporary institutions that work like mimic a museum or political party or a currency or something like that, there is this potential for this poetics that's kind of unstabilizing what's actually taking place. And in a way, I feel like it's the temporarity that enables that ambiguity of like what's actually happening, and that's really what kind of like makes this phenomenon somehow porous and not able to just be fixated on one meaning or the other, or just kind of prevents it from stagnating into these pre-existing patterns in a way. But then I feel that when it's really difficult to sustain that in a like fixed or long-term structure, and I've been thinking of like. Especially like when we talk about subjectivities and the emergence of these different types of subjectivities, it kind of takes time to live through that, to actually really create another orientation towards the world. And I've become more and more skeptical about the potential of art to create these momentary spaces which are more like they're very, very much in danger to falling into being this kind of experiential spectacle, a representation of a societal a projection of a future, something. And so I've been trying to think of like alternatives. I think Solidox is a really good example, but also you're working on a very kind of traditional activist means. And I'm thinking of like how to incorporate that kind of poetic element in that long-term struggle, so that it wouldn't kind of fall into one or the other. And I mean, the examples that I'm thinking of, that the only examples that I can really think of is like the Zapatista or like Christiania or something like that. But it's kind of then it's immediately related to the possession of land and possession of like real autonomy that's usually not possible, or we as art workers or art practitioners or even activists, we kind of like are driven to the opposite direction of like ownership of any kind. So maybe this is the question of like, can you think of like could you talk a little bit about your relationship with the temporarity and stability or long-term projects, and also like ownership of place in relation to this kind of creation of new subjectivities, if it makes sense?
I think you mentioned some really crucial point, and I think that we think of time and temporality, it also relates to mobility issue. I don't know. This is a process. I think that of course temporality could be very useful in order to do exactly what you said. But if our goal is to build alter institutions, we also must think of a long-term project. We also must think of institutions that establish answers to the problems that they're addressing. This is the definition of institution by Foucault or Deleuze, some device that answers to some questions. So I think that we should try to find stable answers to questions that we have today. And the problem is also, again, our mobility as cultural workers, as artists, as curators. I'm not against mobility, of course. It's great and it's necessary. I mean, just to settle in one place, it would be completely out of time. I mean, it would be completely ineffective. But at the same time, I think the fact that we are so so much circulating around the world, that we are, I think, stuck into a mobility. We are stopped by a mobility model that basically denies the possibility of creating stable and effective alter institutions. So we sketch them, we create them on a temporary basis. But what I think is it's a pity is that sometimes these are only sketched and not really empowered as they could be. So how to empower them? I don't know. I have no answer. But also to try to define other models of mobility and other models of authorship, for example, because authorship means ownership on a certain point of view. So collective authorship instead of individual authorship, I don't know. I don't know who's the author of Sale Docs, for example. And I know that this Sale Docs happened because it based itself on a tradition, on an accumulation of force, which was made by what you call kind of traditional autonomous social movements, and it will last also beyond my life, also beyond my contribution. So I think also this kind of makes it a little bit more complex than an Alterinstitutional, which is the work of one artist and is curated by one curator, and it depends on the funds of an institution. But then, for example, we have interesting outcomes too. For example, I was checking the duration of some of the projects that the Sven Lütike mentioned in the article for After All. And I think, for example, Silent University by Ahmet Oghud was initiated, I can't remember precisely now, but in 2012 or something like that, and it's still going on. So, for example, I don't know how it works, but at least it's still going on. So, yeah.
Also, thank you for the talk also, and also thank you for doing Sale Docs, because I've benefited from being able to go to Venice, not me, but our group. We've gone to Venice, and actually it works pretty well, because there's actually, you guys have managed to create resources which are not otherwise available for political actions to cross the lines of territory. For example, with Gulf Labor, we did an action where you guys provided boats from Venice, and that was like a way to kind of surround the Guggenheim in that campaign. So it really is an amazing set of resources to have a functional, long-term community, situation, practice like you have. It's more than just a practice. It's like a set of resources that kind of bubbles over, I think, which is good to talk about. What I wanted to mention, something that is like bugging me, basically, concerning me, is an issue. So Tarika brought up the issue of time, and I'm thinking about space, and basically territory, like the periphery and the center, which has to do with gentrification, basically, because like it's just hard to afford to live in the center. And then at the same time, there's all this pressure to be in the center, because that's kind of the only, it's almost like a direct relationship where the harder it is to be in the center, the more important the center is, right? And the more the center almost becomes the only visible thing there is. And yet, it's like you have to leave the center. So I think everybody feels that kind of tension. And, to relate that to your work, it's remarkable that you're in the middle of Venice, especially right there during the biennial, one of the most visible moments in the art world, and you have a space like right there in the middle of it, and you can run a program there. That's like really, that's not a neutral position, that's a position of occupying the center of visibility, or it's like a central position. And I think that your practice is like a battery that's charged off of that central position, right? And it's the same with activist groups in New York, like Occupy Museums, my group, or Gulf Labor, all those kinds of groups, or even Decolonize This Place, which had the big thing the other day at the Natural History Museum. It's like getting its energy from the high visibility, which then brings media and is connected to markets and stuff like that. So, but I think that there's an anxiety behind all that, which is that like, is this just another part of sort of clamping onto the center, and it's another potential practice of the center, the market being the main part of it? Or is there any self-sufficiency, right, in this practice that you could take with you as you get displaced, right? So I guess my direct question is like, what is the relationship that you've experienced? Because I know you're very much networked into the Italian occupations and different groups, in Milan and all around Italy. What's the relationship that you've experienced between the center and the periphery, and how do you sort of think through that territorial relationship, especially through the lens of gentrification, through this practice?
I feel, for example, that living in Venice, working in Venice, and having kind to relate with events such La Biennale or like very rich museum spaces, we are of course like acting from a center position, but at the same time we're also always at the periphery, you know. And this is also something that we tackle most of the time. It's how do we build a relationship with this center without just being excluded as a periphery and at the same time not being used as a periphery. The post-local activists had exactly this goal. The idea to say, we don't want to opt for a naive position of being the art activist against the system, because you are already, in the exact time you say this, you are already part of the system. There are no peripheries in which you could hide. Of course, there are peripheries in which you can be displaced, but there are no peripheries in which you could hide. So how to relate with this? How to have a sort of conflictive and not naive perspective with the system that tries to include you. So I think my answer to your question would be that it's very difficult for me to say where is the center and where is the periphery. Sometimes you are really at the center, and sometimes you are at the periphery, and you have to kind of to be aware of this in order to sort of organize an effective practice. In terms of actual space and in terms of the city of Venice, for example, one of the researches that we did as Sale Docs was to discover or to rediscover how gentrification worked there. So Venice, the island, the historical city, has now 54,000 residents and has a touristic pressure of over 30 million of tourists per year. So the disproportion is completely crazy, and you feel that even if you're still living in Venice, even if you still can afford an apartment in Venice, every time you walk the streets, you feel you are pushed to the periphery, to the existential periphery of the city. Every time you're in the street, you're in this kind of flowing mass, never-ending flowing mass of tourists. And so we said, does art still have a role in this process of displacement of the people from the city center? And for example, we discovered we analyzed something that everyone knew, but it was not really focused as a problem, that real estate rent parasites art through the business of the collateral events of the Biennale. So more and more like spaces are for rent in Venice for collateral events of the Biennale. These collateral events pay very, very high rents to basically real estate owners and to landlords in Venice. And this is how, for example, real estate parasites art in a place where probably there is no more room for gentrification, because it's almost already gentrified. Still, through this system, for example, real estate rent still parasites an art event such as the Biennale. So, in a way, occupying a space, it's also like a claim against displacement, of course. Occupying a space like we did 10 years ago in Venice means to state that even if we are sort of almost extinct, there are still spaces in which like local cultural producers or artists try to put in place an alternative model of artist production. And I think that if Biennale after Biennale, this event, but not only the Biennale, even other very, very glamorous, rich art events are becoming more and more detached to any type of content and more becoming like mundane occasions. This is something that I feel living in Venice. I mean, another example, which is not the Biennale this year, is the exhibition hosted by Palazzo Grassi, for example, the Damien Hirst huge double exhibition hosted by Palazzo Grassi. So we are more and more confronted to this huge entertainment events, and we try to figure out alternatives. Thank you very much. Thank you.